Imagine 11 temples. They are not built of bricks. They are entirely carved out of monolithic rock, from top to bottom. One mistake, one extra strike, and the roof will be hopelessly ruined, even before the building takes shape. Legends claim it took 24 years to complete. Let's check that with a calculator in hand. Lalibela is located in the Ethiopian Highlands at an altitude of over 8,000 feet, in the middle of a volcanic plateau. 11 churches stand here, each resting in its own personal pit, carved into the stone. Forget about laying walls or transporting blocks. Here, they only worked by subtraction. Excess material had to disappear. And remember, any mistake made during the process cannot be corrected with glue or mortar. The famous Bet Georgis is shaped like a cross. But it's not just a layout, it's a giant cross, as if imprinted into the earth. 40 feet high from the bottom of the trench to the flat roof, which is level with the plateau surface. And this is just one of 11 structures. The scale makes you speechless for a moment. In the first 30 seconds, you don't ask, "How beautiful is this?" Your question is different. What mind designs a building where every wrong step is fatal? Who draws such blueprints even before the first piece of stone is chipped away? Look at Bet Medhan Alem, the largest structure in the complex. 108 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 36 feet high. This is not just a finished building. It's a volume that had to be freed from the rock by first digging a giant trench around it. Before us is a huge stone block, inside which complex architecture is hidden. Let's do a minimal calculation. Just to clear the space around the temple up to the roof level, about 300,000 cubic feet of rock had to be extracted, and that's just the outer shell. But there are also internal halls, columns, vaults, and niches. Conservatively, at least 350,000 cubic feet of stone per church. Official data states the density of local basalt is about 175 pounds per cubic foot. This means that during the construction of just one church, workers had to remove about 30,000 tons of stone, just to reveal the outlines of the building. And note, this is the most modest figure in our calculations. If we take all 11 structures, it turns out that at least 330,000 tons of volcanic rock had to be removed from the Lalibela Plateau. Not moved from place to place, not stacked, but specifically carried away. And this had to be done with precision, so that the intact temple remained standing in the center. Let's distribute this volume over the promised 24 years. We get 13,700 tons per year, or 38 tons daily, without breaks for sleep. Every day for a quarter of a century. No weekends, rainy seasons, sick days, or pauses for sharpening tools. But tonnage is just the tip of the iceberg. The real difficulties begin next. In the 12th century, a builder carving into a mountain had only soft iron, a chisel, a hammer, and his own strength. Archaeologists find precisely such tools, crude, lacking precision, with no hint of diamond coating. In reality, this means that a worker methodically striking stone all day is unlikely to chip off more than a couple of 100 pounds. To reach 38 tons per day, hundreds of people would have had to work simultaneously in one pit. And here we hit a dead end. In a pit that is just beginning to be dug, there is physically no room for such a crowd. The argument, "just bring in more people," works on an open plateau. But in a cramped trench that narrows downwards, space is the most scarce resource. It doesn't get bigger. It's catastrophically insufficient. Want to double-check? Do it twice. And then ask yourself a third question. Where did all this stone go? Every ton extracted from the depths should have settled somewhere on the surface. However, around Lalibela, there are no man-made mountains or giant embankments. There is nothing to indicate the remains of the eaten rock. We've already encountered problems with volume and space, and we haven't even touched upon the technology of the start itself. A regular block church can be rebuilt. A crooked wall can be dismantled. A faulty column reinforced with supports. A monolithic temple carved from a single piece allows no room for error. It has only two states. Either it's not yet finished, or it's ruined forever. The technological process here is irreversible. First, the perimeter is cut into the rock, creating the outer contour. That is, the roof is made first. Then the facade goes deeper. And only at the very end is the internal space created. If you damage the roof before you finish the walls, there will be nothing to fix. This roof is not a covering. It is the last preserved layer of the ancient mountain. This implies that the entire plan was approved before the first hammer blow. The project here is not a draft that is revised on the construction site. It is a mathematical calculation that must be flawless from the very beginning. Every elevation mark, every niche, doorway, or column, everything must be precisely calculated in advance. And all of this within a mountain that cannot be scanned with ultrasound or radar. A building made of blocks forgives errors, and a stone can be trimmed or shifted. A monolith is merciless. If you miscalculate the thickness of an inner wall by just 1.5 feet, instead of a temple, you'll get a pit with holes that cannot be filled. And here's a moment that makes engineers' hands go cold. Statics here work in reverse. In a normal building, the upper stones rest on the lower ones. In Lalibela, the rock supports itself until it begins to be removed. Every extracted foot of material redistributes pressure within the mountain mass. Remove too much in the wrong place, and a crack will appear in the roof before you even reach the floor. Such a feat can only be achieved with absolute knowledge of what lies within the stone. This is not just craftsmanship, it is engineering of foresight. One cannot learn this process as they go, for the result must be perfect on the first attempt. In short, trial and error is out of the question here. 24 years for 11 such behemoths, and they had to work on them in parallel. If they had been built one after another, that time wouldn't have been enough for even one object, to be honest. But these churches don't just stand next to each other. Underground, they are connected by a network of tunnels. A water collection and distribution system turns the 11 monoliths into a single, well-coordinated mechanism. Who could have designed something like this before the first stone was even laid? This is the second argument, and it's much more significant than the first. Even if we assume that the temples were carved independently, although the deadlines are already tight, a mystery remains. How did 11 disparate pits turn into a functioning complex? The temples are connected by passages. These are not just paths, but corridors carved into the rock, some open, some turning into tunnels. Between Beta Georgis and Beta Mikhail, there's a narrow passage that's easy to miss. In other places, staircases plunge deep into the rock and emerge at another threshold. In fact, you can cross the entire plateau, moving from temple to temple without ever going above ground. For a tourist, this is a pleasant bonus, but for a builder, it's a nightmare. Tunnels in basalt cannot be dug at random. They must be part of a master plan even before excavation begins. Two teams working deep within the rock without direct visibility or modern instruments had to meet at a single point. The one who starts digging at point A must know exactly where point B will end. And an error of a couple of inches is already critical. Otherwise, you won't emerge into the temple hall, but into an empty space on the floor below. The rock does not forgive mistakes. A tunnel that deviates by 3 feet becomes a useless hole that cannot be filled. But in Lalibela, everything is different. The passages lead exactly where they need to. Not to a neighboring cave, not to the wrong height. They emerge precisely at head level in the correct temple and at a strictly defined angle. Imagine a modern construction site. 2 work groups approach from opposite sides of a mountain. They have no satellite navigation, no laser levels, no radio communication. Nevertheless, they meet at a single point. And this is not accidental luck, according to Lalibela's archives. Such junctions occurred constantly, at different levels, between separate excavations, after many years. The short verdict? Such results cannot be explained by skilled hands alone. And then water enters the equation. A network of channels is carved around the rock-hewn temples. The torrents that crash down on the Ethiopian Highlands during the rainy season don't just flow downwards, they are intercepted and redirected. Studies and measurements confirm the channels have a precisely calculated slope that rules out randomness. The water flows away from the churches to prevent flooding of the excavations and drains directly into cisterns and pools, which function perfectly to this day. 11 temples, a system of their excavations, passages, channels, and reservoirs. Before us is a complete hydraulic complex carved into the mountain range. Intermediate conclusion? For a product of circumstance, all of this is suspiciously flawlessly planned. This is not just a group of disparate buildings. It is a single mechanism where the 11 visible elements, the churches themselves, are just the tip of the iceberg, and hidden communications ensure the operation of the entire system. Water reception and drainage, movement of people between objects underground. All of this is within one mountain. What does this say about the technology of the process? The tunnels here are not a final finishing touch, but the foundation of the design. They dictate the boundaries of the temples. They determine the depth of excavation to avoid damaging the water supply. They set the thickness of the walls behind which the passages are hidden. The monolith here performs 4 functions at once. It is the facade, the load-bearing structure, the corridor wall, and the water channel. One material for everything, and there is no room for error in principle. The legend, however, claims that everything was built in 24 years. At that speed, today, perhaps only asphalt is laid. Of course, one can attribute the number to symbolism. Medieval chronicles often use beautiful numbers instead of actual accounting reports. Let's assume that. But this doesn't save the official version. It only raises a new question. If 24 years is a metaphor, then what is the real time frame? Let's calculate. As conservatively as possible. Let's assume one worker has phenomenal productivity and extracts 1 ton of rock daily. To remove 330,000 tons, it would take 330,000 man-days. If you bring in 1,000 people, an exorbitant number for a medieval construction site at an altitude of over 2,000 meters, the rough excavation would take about 300 days. 10 months of work. This seems logical until you remember that raw numbers don't account for logistics, precision, interior decor, columns, and niches. Moreover, it's physically impossible to cram 1,000 people with chisels into one excavation pit simultaneously. The actual construction schedule soars far higher. But the main discovery is elsewhere. The principle of more people, faster results doesn't apply here. The obstacle isn't a lack of manpower, but a shortage of space, the demands for precision, and the impossibility of correcting mistakes. Field studies of similar monoliths in Tigray, described, for example, by David Philipson in Ancient Churches of Ethiopia, prove that the precise interior finishing of 1 cubic yard takes significantly more time than the rough excavation of the same volume. Look at the chisel marks inside Bet Amenuel, a small but thoroughly studied temple. The walls there are smoothed to within fractions of an inch. No chips, no rough grooves. Modern measurements show that finishing a surface area of several tens of square feet takes hundreds of man-hours. This applies only to the final interior finishing of one wall, of one building. Now, scale that to all interior surfaces of the 11 churches, to every ceiling, doorway, niche, and column. 24 years will be long gone. Even if you extend this period to 80 years, double the number of workers, and imagine their tools were from the future, the math still doesn't add up. Interior work cannot be infinitely accelerated. In a 3-foot corridor, only one person can work, period. The essence is simple. Fine finishing eats up all the time, which the legend simply doesn't have. Here, the official chronology hits a dead end. And it's not about a conspiracy, but about physical limitations, volume, tools, and space. Even with the most optimistic initial data, the calculations fall apart. It's impossible to adjust one variable without destroying the others. Add time, and you'll fall out of historical dating. Increase the number of workers, and there will be no place for them to stand. Improve the tools, and it will contradict archaeological findings. Any attempt to save the theory is shattered by facts. The density of basalt, traces of processing, and real measurements of the channels. But the most important thing is not in the numbers. The most important thing is in the plan that preceded the construction. Let's imagine that the deadlines were, after all, stretched. Let's say it took 100 years and 3 generations of kings passed. Does this solve the problem? Not at all. It simply moves to another level. A hydraulic system of 11 monoliths cannot be improvised for decades. It requires a detailed drawing even before the first strike on the stone. If the second generation carves tunnels, the first, digging pits, must have already known their future trajectory precisely. Otherwise, they would never have met. But they did meet. All joints are perfect. Channels lead to temples. Tunnels exit precisely into the pits. Water flows as intended. This is confirmed by all measurements. The conclusion is unequivocal. The builders had a complete project. Perhaps in the form of a model or a series of detailed sketches, but it existed, in its entirety, before the work began. And this is where the mystery lies, which cannot be explained by crowds of workers or centuries of labor. The main costs here are not muscular but intellectual. Someone envisioned 11 temples, a network of tunnels, and drainage as a single organism even before the first pickaxe touched the rock. The mountain itself serves as proof of the existence of this mind, because the calculations don't add up, but the complex stands. Let's recall the facts. First, scale. About 330,000 tons of rock were extracted from the plateau, yet there are no traces of giant spoil heaps. This is confirmed by geometric calculations from the University of Zurich. Second, technology. Construction was carried out from top to bottom with no room for error. Tool marks on all objects indicate strict adherence to the work vector. Third, structure. The rock had to maintain stability during the removal of excess masses. This is confirmed by geological data from the German Archaeological Institute. Fourth, logistics. Tunnels connecting independent pits were dug on the first attempt without geodetic errors. Fifth, engineering. A system of channels with a given slope effectively drains the area and supplies reservoirs. This is documented by the Frobenius Institute. And sixth, the legend, which attributes only 24 years to all of this. 5 discoveries and only 1 inconsistency. Even without a technical education, it's easy to understand which link in this chain buckles under its own weight. However, the main problem lies not in disputes about construction dates. The true meaning unites all 5 findings. The implementation of each of them was impossible without comprehensive, detailed design. Forget about approximate sketches or general ideas. This required impeccable engineering calculations, taking into account static loads, the sequence of excavation, room dimensions, the network of passages, and the drainage system. At the same time, traces of such a project are absent. Legends are silent about it, and it cannot be found among monastic archives. This blueprint exists only in the stone itself. By claiming that 11 temples were built in 24 years by ordinary workers with primitive tools, without geo-radars or the right to error, we ignore logic. We choose a version that dry figures and engineering analysis simply negate. Lalibela is not a group of disparate buildings, but a holistic object that only appears different from 11 viewpoints. It is a single mechanism where each block performs 5 functions at once. It is both the external appearance and the load-bearing structure, and the corridor wall, and the drain. Someone clearly saw this entire system before the work began. We do not know the author's name. It is unclear how he verified his calculations. We have no idea how many years were spent on preparation. Only one thing is clear: the project existed. Otherwise, none of these structures would have survived to this day. As a result, the discussion about the duration of construction loses its meaning. These figures are just an error in folk tales, not worthy of attention. What remains is a mystery that mathematics, archaeology, and ancient texts are powerless against. Whose mind is capable of designing something like this before the first hammer blow touched the rock?